morning, everybody. Hello, I am Naomi Smith. I'm Chief Executive of Best for Britain, and welcome to this webinar addressing the economic implications of the double whammy that is Brexit and coronavirus. For those of you unfamiliar with Best for Britain, we are very much a data-led, all-party campaign group that believes that having left the European Union, the UK must now focus on securing a Brexit deal that delivers for businesses, for communities, and for public services across the country. But in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, we are now primarily worried about the impact of leaving the single market and the customs union when the transition period ends on the 31st of December this year, at what will almost certainly be a time of enormous economic pain. So we decided to ask some stridently independent experts to reassess the economic impacts of both a thin free trade agreement and no deal through the lens of the new and perhaps unprecedented recession we find ourselves in because of the virus. And what better week to publish that work than now, as the UK and the EU enter their final round of negotiations ahead of the withdrawal agreement's deadline to secure an extension to the transition period. You can find the full report at bestforbritain.org/impact assessment, all one word, impact assessment. But that's enough from me, because I'm joined today by two panellists, Sam Lowe and Catherine Petrie. Sam is a senior researcher at the Centre for European Reform, member of the government's Strategic Trade Advisory Group, and sleep-deprived dad of a small baby. Welcome, Sam. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Thankfully, the baby is out for a trip to a castle this morning. So
testing your partner's eyesight. Thanks, Sam. We'll be coming back to you shortly. But kicking us off this morning is Catherine Petrie, Chief Economist at the Social Market Foundation and lead author of the report assessing the economic implications of coronavirus and Brexit. Catherine, hi.
Morning, Naomi.
Before you get into your presentation of the key findings of this work, can you just quickly explain to our audience why the coronavirus recession is unlike previous ones and how that affects the ability to make predictions about this one?
Yeah, so this recession is one that we haven't seen in terms of its scale in a long time. It also comes very differently in terms of how output has been affected. We've had an immediate shutdown of a lot of industries, whereas normally you would see a gradual fall in consumer demand or output, whereas we are just seeing complete reductions. And also, we don't yet understand how consumers are going to behave when things open back up, and we also don't know how unemployment will be affected. The government have done the job retention scheme, and that's a really great thing, but we just yet don't know how businesses will respond when that ends and what unemployment will look like.
Thank you, Catherine. While Catherine prepares to share her screen, I'm just going to talk you through the format of this morning. Catherine is going to do a short presentation, followed by a response from Sam, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A, and we should be all wrapped up by 10:15. Just so you know, if you have a question, and I hope that you do, please can you send that question directly to Ludo, L-U-D-O. He's waiting in the chat that's at the bottom of your screen. If you send it directly to him, he'll make sure that those questions come through to me so that you can get your question in time. Over to you, Catherine.
Great. So I have the very fun job of explaining our 60-page report in a couple of minutes, and hopefully I'll be able to do it justice. So we start off by looking at the economic implications of coronavirus and Brexit. And so it's really important to understand the context in which we're looking at these two things. So obviously, coronavirus is a health crisis, but it is going to come with major economic ramifications. And it's really important to understand how that's going to affect the economy and people and places in 2021 and 2022, when we're also going to be experiencing the economic consequences that come from ending the transition period. So throughout the report, we assess two options for that sort of 2021 Brexit scenario, and that is the government's preferred free trade agreement and also potentially leaving without a deal, so trading under WTO terms, and we assess that against the picture of coronavirus in 2021 and 2022. So in order to do that, we have to look at these things in isolation first in order to understand the ways they're going to overlap with each other. So we look at the economic impact of Brexit, which I'm sure many people know the sort of data and where things stand on that now. We've been discussing it for a number of years. So we start off by looking at how the economy in its sort of aggregate is likely to change, and we use analysis by NICE. There are a lot of different economic assessments of Brexit, and we felt like it was just easiest to use other people's numbers as specialists in this time of area, whereas we are not trade economists. And so we can see from NICE's own calculations that gaining a free trade agreement is likely to lead to elevated uncertainty in the economy and lead to a reduction in GDP of about 1.8%. So that's not to say that we would be in a recession, but GDP would be smaller by 1.8%. We also know that in the short run, if we were to not get a deal and we were to go under WTO terms, then that would be about a 2.9% reduction in GDP. So we can clearly see that both options lead to reductions, but one is clearly worse than the other, and that's WTO terms. There are also fiscal implications and immigration implications. So the government is likely to need to stimulate different industries in different places when we leave the EU, and the different parts of the country will be impacted differently, and the government will need to pay for that. So there are obviously fiscal implications, and we also know that the government wants to move to a points-based immigration system, and so we are likely to see changes in immigration in 2021 and 2022. And in order for us to calculate our double impact assessment and look at the places which are going to be impacted by Brexit and coronavirus, we need to understand how Brexit and either trade scenario will impact different industries of the country in order to see how those will materialise in where people work and where people live. So based on the government's own analysis and a range of other literature on reliance on goods, exports and imports and immigration, we're able to categorise the different sectors that make up the British economy into a mild, medium and severe impact category. So they are obviously relative to each other. Mild means sort of lowest impact, medium slightly worse than that, and severe more worse than the medium. So hopefully not too complex to understand. And we can see that if we look at, again, the no-deal WTO terms, things are much worse. So we have a lot less mediumly impacted industries, and we move to severe impact. So we can see that manufacturing, due to its reliance on exports and imports, is likely to be severely impacted, and the same with banking and finance. And obviously the specifics of that under an FTA would depend on what the deal says and how it reacts to different industries, but under WTO terms, we can see that they would be severely impacted. So that sort of sums up where we got to with our Brexit analysis. We also look at regional reliance on imports and exports, and also regional Brexit scenarios, but we'll get onto that later. And then we start looking at the economic impact of coronavirus. So there have been a number of economic impact sort of scenarios and forecasts on coronavirus in the immediate term. So we know it's pretty well understood now that we're going to have a large contraction in 2020. One that we won't have seen on record for a very long time. There is quite a lot of disagreement on the level to which we will bounce back. I think very early on we were talking about a sort of harsh V-shape, and we would be back to pre-crisis levels in 2021, and that's what the blue line from the OBR forecast shows us quite clearly. However, I think as lockdown continues and we begin to understand how this is impacting both the UK economy and global markets, we can see that the sort of projection is much less optimistic. We're unlikely to get back to pre-crisis levels until about 2022 now. And so we can see that the economy is going to be suffering for a while. We know it will be growing again in 2021. It's just that growth will be slow and will be segmented into different places and different industries. And we can also see the same for unemployment. So we know that potentially the rate of unemployment is going to settle somewhere around the sort of 6 to 7% in 2020. It was around 3.8% pre-crisis, so that's a material impact on unemployment. And we can also see that it's unlikely to get back to that 3.8 in 2023 and beyond. So we are going to have a number of people unemployed in the long term who will be impacted. And we also don't know at the moment how these forecasts, whether they are right or not. We simply don't know how employers are going to behave when they need to start contributing to furlough or when furlough ends, and how industries will even be able to cope with the new sort of social distancing and the way consumer behaviours are potentially changing. And that's what brings me on to my next set of analysis. So there's quite a lot of sort of colours and numbers here, but it's not that complex. So we look at impact by industry to understand, again, how we can compare that with the Brexit scenarios. And so the OBR produced a sort of immediate impact of lockdown on different sectors and industries of the economy, and we can see that quite clearly things like accommodation and food services have been really negatively impacted, and things like education, because they simply just aren't open in the same way they were. Industries sort of like agriculture and financial services much less impacted in the immediate term from coronavirus. However, there are differences between the ways that industries will be able to bounce back, and we've seen that in previous recessions, but also the ways in which social distancing and consumer behaviour are really going to impact them in different ways. And that's where we start to look at the sort of 2021 and 2022 impact on these industries. So that's sort of most clear in the chart on the right hand side of the slide. So we group them into broader industries because that's how we approach the Brexit analysis, and that's how the jobs market data is produced. And so we can see that industries sort of like public administration, education and health in the medium term, very unlikely to be impacted in that sort of severe way that we see today in education, because universities and schools will reopen. Yes, they might see reductions in demand from foreign students, but realistically the overall contribution of that category means that its impact from coronavirus is likely to be mild. If anything, the extra spending on health and all that health investment might even mean that industry copes quite well with coronavirus. However, we can see things such as banking, finance and insurance move to a severe impact under our analysis, even though in the sort of immediate term they're impacted only quite mildly. So we believe that if the economy does fall into this sharp recession that we're likely to see, and we do see changes in consumer behaviour and mass unemployment, we will see an impact on the real estate industry, for instance, and that makes up quite a significant component of the banking and finance and insurance, etc. category. The etc. almost stands basically for real estate. And we can see that that has that industry in itself, it contributes a third of UK GVA, so that's gross value added. And so a sort of severe impact in that industry is going to have a material impact on the British economy. And so that sort of sums up our analysis of the two in isolation, and then we move on to looking at them sort of together and in aggregate. So initially we have this sort of low, medium and high categorisation for industries by the Brexit deal scenario or not deal scenario in the bottom chart on the sort of left-hand side of the chart, and then across the top we have the coronavirus impact. So that's just bringing those two industry categorizations that I talked about earlier together, and we can clearly see that there are industries where the sort of low impact is likely to be quite negligible, such as agriculture, and actually some predict that under WTO terms agricultural would actually do quite well, and so that is categorized as low across both sectors, whereas manufacturing, due to its reliance on exports and imports, and also simply because of the coronavirus pandemic, is categorized as medium under an FTA and sort of high risk under a WTO scenario. And the same for banking and insurance, etc. It moves into a high risk category under a WTO. And so we can see that there are clear overlaps in industries that the government would need to support through both of these situations, but there are also industries that are completely new risk to the government, and it might not need it to have worried about them under Brexit scenarios. So if you take construction, for instance, very low risk under Brexit, the government probably didn't have it high on its list of industries to try and support. But we move into this sort of coronavirus pandemic, and suddenly that industry is also of concern. If the sort of commentators are true, we're likely to see a reduction in office building, potentially in central London and in other cities, the sort of movement away from real estate within the cities. And also if we see the sort of reductions in domestic real estate demand, and we might see less home building, etc. And all of that sort of plays into a high impact for construction. So once we've done that and we've assessed how the industries are going to be impacted, we can start looking at how we think regions are going to be impacted. So if we take this chart, we can use the government's own analysis on how regions are likely to be impacted by different Brexit scenarios. So on the sort of y-axis, we have the change in GVA compared to today's arrangements as produced by the government. So it's worth saying that their FTA scenarios are sort of an average FTA and doesn't necessarily capture the one that the government would be going for, as they say in their own words, but it's a good proxy for what we can see an FTA impact would look like on different regions of the UK. So, and we can see that the North East is the most impacted region under either scenario, sort of more than a 10% reduction in GVA under WTO terms. But due to its industrial makeup, we can actually say that it would be mildly impacted by by coronavirus, sorry. So Together that creates like a sort of medium impact for the northeast, whereas London, which is highly sort of unaffected by Brexit in terms of these narratives compared to the northeast, we do notice that it has a sort of severe impact under coronavirus. So then we're able to sort of look at where the sort of medium impact on both things is going to cause, and that's a sort of yellowy shaded area. Those sort of places are likely to sort of face significant risks under both situations. And then that is charted in these two maps, and so that uses the previous categorizations and the sort of lowest to highest impact scale across both FTA and WTO scenarios to look at where the risks are going to materialise the most. So we can see quite clearly that the darkest colours are in the east of England, the North West and the West Midlands. And there is also quite a lot of red in the sort of London and South East. One thing it's always important to remember is that the impact might be as sort of harsh across the country, but the extent to which different regions and places can recover is very important here too. So we know that different parts of the country recovered a lot more quickly, and some haven't still recovered from the financial crisis. So whilst we might be worried about London and the South East, we potentially probably should be more worried about areas in the North West and the West Midlands. And then so we know that regions often hide quite a lot of what's actually going on sort of locally and can make things look better or worse than they actually are. So then we move on to our local area analysis. Again, using those categories of risk and impact that we talked about, we can look at how local economies are built in terms of their GVA. And so, for instance, like how much does manufacturing contribute to that economy? And we rank them in terms of quintiles. It's almost a sort of weighted impact index. So if you've got a really high proportion of your GVA coming from a really high impacted industry, but actually the rest of your GVA comes from low, then we're sort of balancing out those risks and we create this weighted quintile index. And so we can see that if we look at the WTO chart, quite a lot of that Q5 is within the Southeast and within the Northwest and the West Midlands, as we would expect from the previous chart. What it's worth clarifying with this local area analysis is that it's not the same as the government's produced Brexit analysis. So the extent to which the Southeast is impacted to that same extent could be different. So that's why I was talking earlier about local areas and their sort of exposure to the EU in terms of exports and imports. It's really important to understand that that is not necessarily captured here, and so we need to take some of the Southeast with a little bit of a pinch of salt because it's likely to cope better, as we've already shown. And then we can see in this list the areas of the country where more than 50% of their GVA comes from those high impacted sectors. So parts of London, parts of the North West and the West Midlands. And so actually, whilst I've got 70 areas shaded in dark red, there are some areas which are clearly going to be a lot more impacted, even within that 70 list. And then there are things to consider other than GVA, obviously. So it's actually people are more impacted by their jobs than they think they are with GVA. And so it's important to consider the employment prospects. And so we look at how the employment markets of local areas are also segmented into those impacted industries. And so we can see again that the sort of Q5 risk areas are around London, the South East, and that sort of Northwest area, sort of a red wall corridor, if you would. And so we can also see the sort of areas of the country where more than 100,000 jobs are in those sectors. So we do use the NUTS 3 categories, which is a sort of categorization of local areas. And so some of these local areas are actually quite big, but we can still see that there are a substantial number of jobs in those industries. And then quickly, other things to consider is the fiscal implications of this and immigration implications. So the government is going to need to support industries through at the end of the transition period, and it's also going to need to support industries from coronavirus. And that's going to put extra pressure on an already unprecedented level of borrowing, and the extent to which the government has the appetite and also can continue to do that is questionable. And so that leads me to the end of my sort of very quick run through of 60 pages.
Catherine, thank you very, very much. Can we now definitively say that the effects of no deal sort of can't simply be hidden within the effects of coronavirus? It seems from your findings that there most certainly is going to be a significant extra negative impact to come if we leave with no deal.
Yeah, I think we can clearly see that there are industries who would have been okay under no deal, not okay, but not impacted to the same extent, and they are going to face a material impact from coronavirus. So there are winners and losers of both, and there are definitely overlaps, but there are parts of the country that wouldn't have been impacted and now are. So no, we can't just say that the hit has happened, if you will.
Okay, thank you. We've got lots of questions coming through, which is great. Keep them coming, and we'll get to those shortly. Sam, Catherine's run us through the economics of two potential scenarios, but will any of this have any impact on the politics of the talks, do you think?
Well, you would hope so. However, I'm not feeling confident about the next week, in that I don't think there will be any progress on the negotiations due to Barnier and Frost not being able to make the decisions that need to be made in order to progress the negotiation forward. They're big political decisions. The UK or the EU will have to decide to change their approach to negotiations. That requires Boris Johnson on the UK side, member states on the other, and I just don't think we're at that moment yet. But from a UK perspective, and this report, I think what it's very usefully done is interrogate this sort of meme that's permeating Westminster, which is this idea that due to COVID-19, no one will notice the impact of exiting the transition at the end of the year because the economic shock they're already dealing with is so vast. And I think what this research usefully does is it makes the point that actually leaving without deal will create additional new problems and will also compound some existing consequences. And I suppose just as there's a fine line between staying at home in bed unwell and being admitted to hospital, the same is true of the economy. You can tip over the edge quite quickly, and it can just be a small thing in the end that does it. But the question from a political perspective is one of risk, as in, does this pose a risk to Boris Johnson's premiership, and as a result, does it cause him to change the course of direction? So in this case, I would say the question is, well, will he decide to extend the transition period or not? And the answer is we just don't know. But I would make the case that if he were to go up on a podium on a Sunday night on television and say, well, we need to extend the transition period because we need to buy more time because of coronavirus, I think that's something the public would accept and inherently get behind. Of course, there would be a few people who are arguing. Just another couple of points. The other really good thing this report brings to light, and it's something we all know but just seems to be under-discussed, is that exiting the transition period at the end of the year with or without a deal is going to be consequential for the British economy, and it's going to be quite a big rupture for many businesses who are going to have to change how they approach that. So from a practical point of view, asking businesses to prepare for this transition, and it's still very possible a free trade agreement could be concluded this year, but if you're asking them to change overnight on January 1st, whilst also having to deal with the fallout from coronavirus, you really are putting quite a lot on their plate. And from my perspective, that's not a particularly fair thing to be asking of business at the moment. And there's a question as to whether that will start to play into the political debate anytime soon. Business response has been quite muted this year, largely because many think that if they speak up too loudly on Brexit, they might be punished in other ways, especially when you're thinking about coronavirus and all of the reliance on government that exists there. But it could change. My general feeling, to conclude, is that if there is going to be movement on the future relationship, it will most probably be after the summer, and we will find out what happens then. And my hope then is, if the transition period hasn't already been extended, some sort of new implementation period comes into effect, because I'm not sure business is going to be able to cope with a January 1st, or if we assume that's a bank holiday, a January 2nd rupture.
Thank you. Most deals, most free trade agreements around the world are about reducing barriers to trade between countries. And this one is actually about erecting barriers to trade. So, in light of that, do the findings in this report surprise you?
Not necessarily. I have a question about agriculture. But I understand the logic as to why agriculture hasn't been so badly effective, in that import substitution kicks in. So we start just producing more in the UK that we would otherwise import from elsewhere. But I don't know, if you go through the agriculture sector, some are quite exposed to Brexit, and also the fishing industry as well, where if you're the onshore fishing industry, your entire market is in the EU.
We do actually have a question waiting in the wings about fish, so we'll come to that, and I'll put that to Catherine. A question to both of you, actually, before we go to the questions from our listeners. To what extent can these negative figures be offset by future free trade agreements with other economies, such as the often talked about USA trade deal?
Who do you want to go first?
Go for it.
You can go first, Sam.
Okay. Well, it can't. As in, so I've worked on trade for quite a while, and one of the sort of guilty secrets from people about free trade from people who work on it is that free trade agreements do very little for GDP. So to give an example, the very most optimistic scenario of trade agreement with the US, which is the biggest one we can do, comes in as increasing GDP in the long run by 0.04% or something like that, and 0.4%. Sorry, and if you look at like previous projections, because this always gets clouded by Brexit, people say, well, that's just because the civil service are biased or the like, and they've come in too low. But if you look at, say, TTIP, which was the EU-US trade negotiation, started back in 2013, when the impact on the UK was modelled for that, the most optimistic scenario had UK GDP increasing by 0.35%. We're talking about largely rounding errors, and you can get into discussions about second-order effects around productivity. I largely do think free trade agreements are still a good thing to have, and in the context of the UK having left the EU, I think we probably do need to strike some new ones, but we shouldn't pretend that they're going to compensate for the new barriers to trade that we've put up with our most important trading partner.
Thank you. Catherine, anything to add on that?
Have much to add there. It's also important to see that in the government's regional analysis that we used, they already include the impact of other free trade agreements in their modelling, and we're still seeing an impact of over 10% in the northeast. So, I mean, it doesn't look great, does it?
No. Okay, fantastic. Well, we've got lots of questions. We've got one, well, actually several, I think, in one from Peter Foster at the FT. So I think Carl's going to unmute Peter so that he can ask you that question directly, Catherine.
Good morning. Thanks for a lovely presentation. I just wonder whether you have any nervousness. Obviously, all this is modelling and forecasts on the impacts of services on a no deal. I know Sam's also done work on this because they seem intuitively very high. You look at table 3, page 16 of the report, 65% drop over 10 years in services. Can you contextualise these? Do you think that the EU will really hold the line on mode 4, on business qualifications, etc., given how close we are to them? And do these predictions take into account all these mitigations that anecdotally you hear about, lawyers registering in Ireland, getting jurisdictional workarounds? Because prima facie, they just feel instinctively, they feel high. And when you talk to people in services, it feels high to them.
Yeah, so I think in terms of sort of trepidation with all this forecasting, yes, that is completely why that we haven't tried to put any of our own numbers on this stuff. We are very aware that the economic landscape of the UK is changing sort of minute by minute at the moment, and trying to forecast a reduction in services whilst also trying to take into account the impact of coronavirus just felt like a sort of risk too far to us. I am not a specialist in service. That's why we've used other people's analysis as much as possible in this. Is what we really wanted to do was look at the double impact. So yes, I think that's why we've categorised banking, finance and insurance as a severely risked category in both under Corona and under WTO terms. And I think, yeah, the impact is going to be substantial there. I'm not sure if does that answer your question, and I think that was everything I would say on that.
Thank you, Catherine, and I'll just bring Sam in on that.
So my argument would be actually that yes, the figures are probably a bit too high as a service-wide, as a sector-wide figure of 60%. That's the upper end of what I'd expect for, say, financial services over a long period of time in which the EU's unilateral measures expire and the EU starts to bring into place new regulatory measures that incentivise onshoring. But other bits of the sector, it all depends how they sell now. If you're say a professional business services, so you're doing management consultancy or the like, for the most part, you probably already sell out of a local office based in the EU. So whilst Brexit causes problems around movement of people, about recognition of qualifications, you don't necessarily have to fundamentally restructure in order to deal with it. That's not the case in banking insurance, where much of the EU-wide sort of trade was done from the UK, and there's going to be barriers to doing that in future, although there is obviously equivalence discussion and the like that will mitigate it slightly.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Richard Corbett, if he could be unmuted, please.
Hello, I was puzzled by the low estimation of the damage to agriculture and fisheries, but Sam has in the meantime drawn attention to that anyway. After all, nearly 80% of the fish we catch is exported largely to the EU. And that's true of large sections of agriculture like mutton, for instance, and sheep products. And both sectors also rely quite a lot on labour coming in from other European countries, seasonally in the case of agriculture. So I was expecting them to be listed as being badly hurt by even an FTA, but certainly a WTO Brexit. Is the counter argument that there will be a large pool of unemployed labour in Britain that will voluntarily start working in the fields and will at least mitigate that aspect of it, if not the export aspect of it?
Thanks, Richard. Catherine?
Yeah, so we simply just use the other people's analysis on this. And so I did a lot of reading about agriculture, and there are quite a lot of in-depth studies on it, and I simply picked the study that I thought was also the most sort of cited, and also people were using it in their own analysis, and the government have also mentioned it in their analysis. And so to me, that sort of low categorization felt acceptable. And we do mention in the report that some people do talk about this increase under WTO terms and sort of domestic production being able to sort of increase, although that would lead to higher prices, and will consumers pay it if we're in the middle of a recession and a slow recovery from coronavirus? Unlikely. And so we have spoken in the report about our trepidation around that low impact, but it's also worth saying that things obviously do change, and the immigration figures are unlikely to help it stay in the low category. A lot of industry categorisation on Brexit doesn't include the impact of immigration, which is just sort of unhelpful. I also think people are too quick to think about fields and local employment and not actually seeing whether they match up or not. If I've got mass unemployment in Birmingham, that's not going to help me pick lettuce in Cambridgeshire, where my parents live. And so I think there is quite a mismatch here in what we're talking about. So I agree that the sort of low needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, but it's really hard to do this sort of stuff on an industry basis with the sort of lack of whole-rounded assessments that have gone on in all sort of fronts.
Thank you, Catherine. Sam, any more on fish for us?
Well, just to put forward the argument in favour for agriculture not being so badly affected, which I'm not entirely convinced for, but there is an argument, which is so it's around the idea that if we're unable to buy, say, pork cheaply from Denmark and the Netherlands anymore, that will incentivise producers in the UK to start producing it here, and that is already happening to a degree. So there's a big pig factory planned in Northern Ireland, where on their planning permission application they said, well, why would you be economically viable? They said, well, because of Brexit, all of the supermarkets are looking to try and source pork domestically within the UK. So there are substitution effects as well, and this sort of gets missed in the debate. It's why the Nissan debate is actually much more complicated than people think. It's because you will get some economic activity moving to the UK because of Brexit, because of new trade barriers. It's just the sort of economic analysis says that it's still a net negative. You'll get disruption, people will lose their jobs, but there will be jobs created as well. I mean, my job exists because of Brexit. There's going to be 50,000 customs officers' jobs that exist because of Brexit. It's not as easy to sort of discuss it on aggregate as people might expect.
Thank you. And you mentioned Northern Ireland, and we have a question about just that from John Peat at The Economist. If he could be unmuted, please. Morning, John.
Yes, hello, good morning. Now, I suspect the answer to this may be no, but I wondered in your report, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I wondered if you'd looked specifically at the issue of Northern Ireland if we go to a WTO Brexit, because of course Northern Ireland is in a special position where there will be barriers between NI and GB. And as you've seen, the House of Lords reports that business in Northern Ireland are very nervous because they will have a special problem in trade, particularly of things like agricultural produce. And yet Northern Ireland doesn't come out too badly from your scenarios, and I would have thought it might suffer actually rather more than the rest of the UK.
Thank you. Catherine and then Sam.
Yeah, so we have looked at Northern Ireland in terms of its industrial makeup and how those industries we've categorised, but we haven't specifically looked at the sort of future relationship and what that means for Northern Ireland specifically. So we obviously present the government's analysis on the regions, and that clearly shows Northern Ireland being quite negatively impacted. And we can also see that Northern Ireland is again in those sort of darker shades of red in terms of its industrial makeup, but the specifics of orders was not into consideration for us.
And Sam, what about the argument that we sometimes hear from certain people in government that actually Northern Ireland's going to end up with the best of both worlds and not have a severe negative impact?
Well, I think it shouldn't be phrased like that, in that Northern Ireland is going to be severely hit by Brexit, as is everywhere. I suppose the question is, does its special future relationship with the EU and its status as a component part of Great Britain give it some advantages over, say, Liverpool or Scotland when it comes to investment, if, for example, you're a manufacturer that still wants to sell into the EU on the same terms as now, and also into Great Britain? And a lot depends on the detail of the future of the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, specifically when it comes to trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But my answer there is I probably need to do some deeper analysis on it, but I think there will be a lot of disruption in Northern Ireland, but it will potentially prove more attractive for certain types of investment in future than before, vis-a-vis other bits of the UK, because of this relationship it has with the European Union. But that doesn't mean it's not going to be quite a rough ride towards getting there.
And that's without us talking at all, of course, about the conflict in Northern Ireland, and that it is very much a frozen, not a resolved conflict. Okay, our fourth question is coming in from Mike Galsworthy. If Mike could be unmuted, please.
Hi there. So my question pertains to leaving on WTO terms and the state of the WTO itself. We've heard reports recently of the chief resigning abruptly, financial problems, a broken arbitration panel, and the US making moves to pull out. Does this actually make a difference to our trading environment if we were going to go out on WTO terms? Does the fractious nature of trade around the world now mean that this would make things more advantageous or more difficult for us if you've got basically a WTO that's non-functional, or does it really not make too much of a difference anyway?
Thank you. Over to Sam, please.
The fact that the international rules-based order is breaking down is a problem for the UK, regardless of the future relationship with the European Union, whether it's under a free trade agreement or not. Obviously, being under a free trade agreement helps in that you've actually got a working relationship with the EU, which is one of the major players in all of this, and you've got a structured way of sort of working through any problems. But I'm not sure it makes too much of a difference either way if we're pointing specifically at the disruption at the WTO and the like. If we leave without an agreement with the EU, we will trade on the basis of our WTO commitments, which is the levels of tax we set on imports that will be applied to all countries with which we don't have a free trade agreement. All of that just applies. If the US could behave badly and treat us badly, whether we have an FTA with the EU or not, it doesn't. I'm not sure how much of a difference that makes.
Thank you. Catherine, do you want to come in on that? I mean, obviously making predictions about whether or not there will even be a WTO or not is almost impossible, and whether they could be factored into your work. But any views for Mike?
No, I think Sam covered it all.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, then we have a question from Stephen Kinsella. Stephen, if you can be taken off mute and ask your question, that'd be great.
Very good, thanks Naomi. And thanks to the team, actually. I found that presentation very, very good and very clear. I'm not an economist, and so I, maybe like many people, struggle to understand what we mean when we talk about an impact on the economy or on GDP. Has there been any attempt to translate that into impacts on jobs, whether across the country as a whole or regionally?
Catherine, yeah, you're best placed to answer this one.
So as far as I'm aware, the analysis tends to focus on the sort of aggregate economic impact and then also local sort of economic impacts. And that's why we try to then also look at employment, the sort of industrial makeup of employment. What we can't predict, I mean, it's just simply impossible to predict the sort of percentage reductions in employment in different parts of the country. And it depends on which businesses do well and which businesses don't. And so we can clearly see that there is going to be an impact on unemployment, both from Corona and from Brexit. And again, they're going to come from different places potentially. and we can start to see what parts of the country that's going to impact. But I think putting a number on it at the moment is very difficult. There are just sort of too many unknowns.
Thank you, Catherine. Sam, any final thoughts from you?
Well, just on the jobs question, so going back to why you have to be a bit careful with models, trade models aren't very good at jobs. They tend to just assume that employment remains the same and that people just, in a normal trade analysis, because you're lowering barriers, move from lower productivity sort of employment to higher productivity employment over time, but there's no aggregate loss of jobs because you look at it over the long run. Of course, this isn't true. It's not that easy to go from being a farmer to a lawyer. Maybe it's easier to go from being a lawyer to a farmer in this case. I'm not sure. But it does. People do tend to steer clear of it when looking at trade impacts, just because it's really difficult to do.
Thank you. Well, that is all we've got time for this morning. Any of you who know me know that I am a very strict chair and keep to time with meetings. But if we've not answered something that you would like to get a response from us on, do get in touch with us at Best for Britain and we will do our best to get you an answer. An enormous thank you to our panellists, Catherine Petrie from Social Market Foundation and Sam Lowe from the Centre for European Reform, to the brilliant Best for Britain team for helping pull this together, and every one of you who has joined us this morning and asked questions. As a reminder, the full report is at bestforbritain.org/impact assessment, and we hope to see you all again very soon. Don't worry, we have plenty more data and research up our sleeves coming out over the weeks to come. Thank you all very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.